Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Axelos Global Best Practice live stream. It's been a while since we've done this, so forgive me if I'm a bit rusty. But today we thought we'd discuss an industry-specific topic. We're going to be talking about the aviation industry or the air travel industry. And I'm joined by a fabulous panel here today. You may recognize some of the faces from an earlier live stream that we did, but I'll quickly introduce everyone and then we'll kick off the discussion itself. Just a reminder, this is YouTube Live, so you can use the live comment section to put in any questions you may have during the course of our conversation. And we've got a small team monitoring the chat, and they'll be feeding questions back to me. And so towards the end, we'll do a bit of a Q&A, and you'll have your chance to ask the panelists questions directly. I think we have two Australians and one person based in France. Or two people based in Australia, one person based in France. I don't want to guess nationalities here. So I'll start from east to west with Katrina McDermott. Some of you may recognize Katrina from, as I said, the prior live stream that we did talking about customer experience and employee engagement and how the two relate and so on. Katrina is one of our ITIL masters, and we're very proud that she's accomplished such a distinguished designation. She's been at Qantas for many, many years before striking out on her own to become a highly successful consultant trainer in the APAC region. So Katrina, welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Akshay.
And now the second person all the way on the other side of the world is Peter McDonald, who was also with Qantas for many, many years before striking out last year as a consultant. While at Qantas, he was head of Qantas Group Technology, after being head of IT business partnership with the commercial and customer business units. He's got a wealth of experience with leading large teams and working across IT stakeholders to accomplish the goals of the organization. And last but certainly not least is Chris Dolphin, who's based in France. And some of you may recognize Chris from the earlier panel that we did with Katrina talking about employee experience and customer experience and so on. Chris used to work with a company that I only first heard about when Katrina introduced him to me, which is a company called Amadeus. Until that point, the only Amadeus I know was Mozart. But Amadeus is a very large global company that works behind the scenes of many airline operations, doing a multitude of different supply chain logistics, fulfillment type work, and they have a heavy reliance on IT systems. And at Amadeus, Chris was a director of IT before becoming the VP of IT. More recently, he's also become a consultant and advisor to numerous other companies around the world, drawing on his wealth of experience at Amadeus. So, Chris, welcome back as well. I'm so glad you could all join us. Before we start, did I miss anything off those intros? Any sort of social media plugs or social media channels you'd like to plug?
Of course, actually, always. As you know, my ITIL training is available on my website, katrinamcdermott.com. Thank you.
Excellent.
You can find me on LinkedIn, and I think you also have a picture of my email address, which you can contact me by.
Sure.
Yeah, pretty similar for me. Best way is via LinkedIn at this stage. So.
All right. So before we start, the aviation industry is very wide in scope, and I think our audience would benefit from us sort of level setting what the scope of our discussion is going to be. Because when we were first developing the scope of this discussion, and we started using the term aviation industry, I think we struck a few concerns that, we're not necessarily talking about aviation safety, we're not talking about aviation engineering. So what is it that we are actually going to be talking about? I think we're going to be talking about how service management plays an experience in bringing air travelers the best travel experience that they can have. does anyone else have any sort of other angles in which they want to proceed with this discussion?
I think if I can add, actually, I mean, I've seen the aviation industry evolve from what we used to simply call a booking, a hotel, flights, to now being more of a fully connected service offering to the traveler. So I think when we look at the aviation industry, I think from an airline perspective and from a service provider perspective, I think we need to look at this from the traveler standpoint and also what it means from an ITSM standpoint.
Of course, yes, customer first, customer-centric view, absolutely correct. Peter, I'll come to you first. What are some of the key business drivers that you've seen play out in the industry, in the air travel industry?
Yeah, I think, well, for me, and it's probably a little bit with Chris, I think we bring in an interesting dynamic here, one playing from the customer side and one, Chris and I know each other, being from Amadeus on I guess the supplier side of the equation. But, ultimately, I think airlines have moved into creating experiences for people by connecting that. And to do that, we've had to effectively, as you said, everything's about putting the customer at the center of all of our decisions and what we need to do. So I think what we've seen airlines move away from traditional sort of metrics about, are we arriving on time, to how we're actually measuring that end-to-end service experience of our customers and what feedback that can provide. And what we've seen more over time now recently is how do we put more information in the hands of those frontline employees who can create those more unique experiences. So it's been an interesting one to sort of watch over the last sort of, I'd say, 4 or 5 years as we've pivoted into that conversation. But underlying metrics will always be important around on-time performance, because we still know that's one of the biggest gives in the airline, which is if you can't get people home or to their destination on time, it's always going to be a big negative. But I think there's more appreciation, there's impact around those things. But we've certainly seen a lot around the NPS type equation,
right?
That promotion score.
Right. But so then, I suppose, Katrina, I'll come to you with this question. How would you reconcile what Peter was just talking about, putting the customer first and providing that good experience, with, for example, the rise of no-frill airlines and budget airlines, which probably is the opposite of what I'd consider a pleasant experience in many ways?
No, you're right, and low-cost carriers. And I guess, actually, if I put it into context about the two gentlemen on the screen, is Chris was a supplier, Amadeus, to Qantas, and Pete was a customer, if you will. And my role was to renegotiate the service level and operating model between Qantas and Amadeus. So the two gentlemen on your screen, we've had some really great, robust conversation while negotiating service levels. Very robust conversations. And my remit from Pete, I reported to Pete, was to reimagine service levels. And I spent over a year doing that with Chris and his team also. So what Pete was saying is that really Amadeus had service levels based on availability and response times. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Amadeus were allowed to have 5 priority 1 incidents before there was any breach of a contract of SLAs. So we really had to reimagine, and what Pete was saying, it's not about availability, even though they are important, it's about what you're measuring in the customer experience. And you're right, the service levels and what we measure for a low-cost carrier versus a premium airline like Qantas are somewhat different, because Qantas, it is about the customer experience. So I actually, if I tell a quick story, I was doing a continual service improvement, ITIL version 3, on an issue that Amadeus had, Chris, sorry, on what we call dupe seating. So if you're assigned the same seat number as a passenger, so it's called dupe seating. We did a continual service improvement, and I presented to the business and the lady that ran airports. My metrics was 5% less incidents next month, or mean time to restore would be improved. And she said to me, Kat, why don't we look at less customer complaints? And that was a real moment for me of, are we measuring the right thing? And with Pete's support and Chris's organisation, we did completely reimagine what we measured.
Right. And Chris, from the supplier side, what are the sort of key business drivers that you see coming into play on that side of the fence?
I think it was all around what customers expected. And from a supplier standpoint, and it's something that we've debated now for many years, I often question, did we go far enough to understand the business element on the airline side? And I think this is one of the biggest drivers. I think suppliers, not today, but let's say for tomorrow, will need to become more than just a B2B and more B2B2C, simply to better understand the business drivers of the airline. Because if we look at it only from our standpoint, from a supplier standpoint, we're going to miss a significant amount of information.
And I'll stay with you for a moment, but this question is primarily for yourself, Chris, and then Peter. Obviously, we're seeing the second, third, fourth, fifth surge of COVID around the world. It's been with us for the last 12 months, and no doubt it's impacted many sectors. Travel included. I would say travel has been very heavily hit. How have you seen the pandemic impact, not necessarily business results, but has it impacted the drivers that you are seeing within the organization? Has it now shifted from, let's say, understanding your customer to extreme cost cutting or trimming of waste?
From the companies I'm working with at the moment, there's two things. There's a cutting of costs, simply to remain somewhat profitable in these times. But there's also reinvestment, particularly in the area of digitalization of some of the services they're offering. And I think and I had a conversation with one of the IT players last week where the discussion was more around, okay, how do we move from a 36-month sales cycle to a 12-month? And how can we deliver more technology faster than we've done in the past? And I think this is where I've seen the biggest drivers. Now, from a metrics perspective, I think that's going to change. And I think you're going to see more IT providers sit down with the airlines and with the airports, because they also play a key role, to look at what are the new business drivers or the new business metrics that they need to be measuring to bring value.
Sorry, I just want to pick up on one point you just mentioned. Did you say a 36-month sales cycle?
Yeah, some of the big providers have a 36-month sales cycle and sales and delivery cycle. And I think that's going to be far too long going forward.
Okay. Peter, I'll come to you with the same question. How have you seen the pandemic change some of these perspectives and drivers within the industry?
Yeah, I think I'd concur with Chris's point. I'd add one more to his point, though, which is that, I think airlines are now trying to give confidence back to passengers. So the idea of flying where you fly, you think even just pick the Australian market, is how do you encourage people to know that it's safe to get on an airline and go somewhere, and so I think the drive is different. So how do we give people certainty about that experience in this time? But, Chris is right. I think at first we saw cost cutting because airlines needed to basically reduce the cost base. I think they've also seen the opportunity, which is pandemic showed us we could make really tough decisions and do things really, really quickly in a very different way that we hadn't done before. So I think there was a risk appetite because we had no choice. And in doing so, I think that's going to sort of change how organizations go forward, which is about how do we maintain some of that agility in the decision making and the speed of implementation, or basically to introduce change across the organization as sort of travel comes back and the demand starts to increase, I would expect.
Just staying with the state of industry for just one more question. We've also seen how whilst a lot of B2C companies have been affected by the pandemic, shipping and logistics have really boomed because online shopping has boomed. So are you also seeing that the mix of services being offered or service offerings has sort of the demand, has changed? So there's more demand for freight services than there is for passenger travel. And how is the industry responding to that sort of shift in service demand?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. Yeah, I think it's true. We've certainly seen a shift in certainly freight. You can think about companies like that in Australia Post. The access to being able to use use more dedicated aircraft. And I think it's about how to use those assets differently. I think what we're finding is, and most organisations are going to start to do this, and I think Chris will see this as, from a supplier side, is that consumption-based model and ability to drive, turn off costs very, very quickly is going to be absolutely important going forward. People aren't going to sign long-term hooked contracts with high floors anymore, because I think the reality is, if something else happens, another pandemic, you need to be able to get the cost out of your business extremely quickly, and the only way to do that is have a consumption-based model. So I think organisations are looking for much more leverage in their contracts or ways of working with partners so they can steer those costs more dynamically going forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the key points going forward is airlines and suppliers and airports, because and I mentioned this before, will need to change the way they operate and the way they do business. And I think you'll find more and more value being realized in services rather than just simply products, because it's going to come down to services more and more over the next 2-3 years.
Okay. So that's a good segue into sort of the next topic, which is how and where service management comes into play across the industry. I mean, we've all been exposed to ITIL. Certainly, there's a lot of other perspectives of service management, enterprise service management or business service management. But where do we see that sort of formal approach to service management across the sector? And Katrina, I can think of no better person to jump in with an answer here.
Thank you, Akshay. Yeah, when I was negotiating the contracts between Qantas and Amadeus, and I've often said this, as you know, Akshay, that ITIL did provide the framework and a common language, except in some cases, which Chris is going to talk about in a moment. And if I may say so, Chris, one thing that Amadeus and Qantas could never agree on was priority versus severity. So Amadeus calls incident severity 1, severity 2, and Qantas does what industry standard does, is priority 1 and 2. We didn't really win that battle, but ITIL was I often say I don't know what we would have done without having the framework of understanding, what an incident was, and again, Chris, we spent a lot of time negotiating problem, and it was a very interesting time, Akshay, because Amadeus didn't contract to do problem management, which was, I found, very, very interesting. It was just incident management. And would you agree with that, Chris?
I don't remember, Katrina. It's been a very long time ago.
Yeah, and obviously, how change was done, what changes Amadeus would show to Qantas, and as you say in the synopsis, Akshay, it really is fascinating the role that IT service management and ITIL plays in getting a plane off the ground. And we quite often forget that when we're sitting on an aeroplane and enjoying the travel, but what has gone behind the scenes in IT. And I think we need to celebrate that, because as I said, it's quite often we're the people in the back, but if it wasn't really for what we do, we're for compliance, for fuel, for crew, for catering, we have to have IT service management around that.
Right. And so on the supply side, Chris, where do you see sort of service management or service thinking come into play? Is it still on the IT side, on the infrastructure side, or do you see service management play out across companies in different ways, whether that's called enterprise service management or business service management, etc.?
I think I would start by touching on a point that Katrina made. When you look at an airplane being pushed back forward with passengers, you don't realize the number of different players, the number of different feed of information that comes in to make that a reality. What I've seen is across all players, there's a good level of ITSM introduced. I mean, I think 99% of the time, we spoke the same language. We understood each other. We had the same vocabulary. So it's there. Maybe at various levels of adoption, but it's there. Now, where we start to see areas where things can be a little gray, it's around the definition of what is a priority 1, 2, 3, or 4, and what's severity 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I think that's linked to the fact that the business has evolved so quickly, but not necessarily the definition of what's priority 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I think this is where I see the biggest gap today in terms of ITSM. Whether it's business service management or enterprise service management, there's still a lot of work to be done there, especially when you look at an airline. When I see an airline, I see two very distinct divisions. I see airline business, and on the other side, I see the airline IT sector, and then you have the service provider. And then this is where I think things could get a little bit gray, a little bit unclear, and where there's still work to be done. I don't know what you think, Pete.
Look, there's elements I agree. I think what ITSM, ITIL has done for many years is help technology organisations with their partners find a common way to operate, find a common language, so that when things are not working, you've got a basis to fall back on. I think where the step change is coming from is that, and I think this is the journey we were definitely stepping into, is making much more connection at a service layer around, okay, well, what's the impact to our booking engine from a ability to basically take bookings so we can fill those seats, or the ability to push a plane back full of passengers, or an ability to board passengers at a particular rate. I think that's where the gap has been, which is to, irrespective of what's going on, if you can articulate the impact from a customer level, then you simplify the argument about what the impact really is to the organization, because you're able to demonstrate, how much money you're losing per hour by the website not being available, or, the cost of a plane not being pushed back and you have to pay additional fees for holding it on the ground, So there are ways of doing it, but it takes time and energy to sit down and have those conversations. And I think, and the hardest part then is actually to sit down with your partners and your own organization and play that out so everyone understands it. And you've got to keep that communication channel live and open. And I think for me, sort of leading teams and stuff like that, what I've always believed in is trying to have those metrics and that visibility and the transparency, so that we're all being measured the same way.
So one thing that both of you didn't mention, which I thought was interesting, because I know that this was, I think, where Katrina based her ITIL master's thesis, was the frontline agents who are interacting with travelers on a day-to-day basis at the airports, and the sort of frontline systems that these travelers interact with. Katrina, do you find that the agents, customer service staff that you see in the airports, are they sort of akin to customer support agents, sitting at in a sort of call center help desk sort of a scenario? Do the same skills come to bear, or are there different techniques and different skills or mindset that's needed for these people?
I think it's the same but different. It is certainly about the customer experience, with a lot of investment spent on training and ensuring that that experience is realised. What I did find, and you're right, I did my master's on this actually, was one thing we need to be mindful of is when we're designing support models, we have to design for the people. And again, as you know, I think that a lot of organisations continue to use a support model that's 30 years old. We call a service desk. A frontline worker that has to board 300 passengers and the scanner breaks, they're not going to call a service desk. It's as simple as that. They will either find another scanner that works or move to a different gate. And we expect, as I said, the model is that you have to call the service desk, single point of contact. And what we found, and Pete will attest to this, is that we end up with a lot of broken equipment at airports. And then IT gets a bad rap because nothing works because it wasn't reported and we don't know about it. So I think that what we need to be mindful of frontline work is that we have to design support models around them, because in a contact center, they're sitting at a desk and they can deal with the customer. But with frontline staff, they're very mobile, you know, from engineers on the ground to check-in agents, etc. And that's what I'm really passionate about, is designing, understanding the people, and then designing the service around that. And I mean IT support services.
Right. So with that said, then on that note, I suppose Pete, I'll come to you with this follow-up question. Does this mean that there's a greater emphasis on more automation, IoT type of investments for frontline staff, so that, you know, for example, if that scanner stops working, IT immediately knows about it? Or has that sort of is that investment only now starting to make its way to the front line?
No, we've certainly seen that shift. So, you know, one of my metrics for a service desk is we should almost have 0 calls, you know, especially in this day and age with technology. We should be in a place which is, for those simple things like, there are enough warning signs going off and enough, whether it's IoT or the use of data to basically start predicting when things are going to start to break. So we should be able to see the warning signs and start to put up the fences early, rather than we become the recovery mechanism. So the shift that we were making was to go from, you know, I used to sort of talk about it being, you know, we'd get to the cliff and fall off, and we were very good at the recovery, bringing in the ambulance and the paramedics. Now what we want to do is actually put up the fence and slow the fall, so before we actually get to that perspective. So from a frontline worker perspective, you know, having teams of technicians who can walk out and replace devices simply at an airport, it makes much more sense, because they can see what's working and not working. But, you know, those frontline teams now have become so much more enabled, because they walk around with an iPad or a mobile device, and in that they have a lot of the data which was sitting in the background, which has all been digitized, so they know who the passenger is, what experience they've had, what flight they're going on, you know. And this is where we rely on the partners like Amadeus to be able to sort of centralize and bring that data to us really, really quickly. You know, but we've seen other innovations happen. You know, you go back 10 years ago, we didn't have Wi-Fi in an aircraft. Now we have Wi-Fi, and you look at things like Microsoft Teams. We've, you know, experimented using Microsoft Teams in an aircraft to basically call the ground and show the engineers the problem we're having. So when the time they arrive, they already know what they have to do. So
right. All
these new things are absolutely helping us to actually get ahead of the curve and start to improve. But you've got to rethink the problem from we're here to respond to actually we're here to prevent.
That's very interesting. And Chris, air travel. Okay, I mean, this is not meant to be a platitude. We know air travel is very complex, but I think one of the complexities that a lot of people don't see is having to work with multiple governments, multiple regulators, ensuring that data is secured correctly, access is permitted only in certain situations. How do you? What's your experience been dealing with, you know, complex and I'm sure often conflicting regulatory frameworks around air travel as a supplier, managing that sort of back-end supply chain across multiple countries and territories?
Yeah, from my experience, I think what we did was very, very good. One, even at my level at the time, I had very little access to much of the information or much of the data. Most of the information was encrypted. And what the company did at the time, which I think is very clever, they started with the most restrictive settings. So across the board, regardless of the government, the starting point was extreme restriction. And from there, because of the capability of the system, then you can configure based on country, including the way things are displayed. So I think the technology is there, and the right people behind it is also there. I mean, we and I say we now, but at the time it is, and I'm sure they still do, had some of the best guys looking at data protection. And there was a dedicated team for this, not only data protection, but also security, which is a very, very big part of everything that they do today and everything that takes place in the travel industry.
presumably you'd have to also have a very close relationship with your governance, risk and compliance teams, with your legal teams, etc., so you could understand how to best protect the company, because you're dealing with very, very complex regulatory frameworks and from around the world. Would Apart from, of course, the sort of business service lines, would you say that, I mean, on balance, who else were some of the very important stakeholders with whom you'd had to deal with internally?
I would give one example, and I think if you look at the United States of America, this was one, and if you look at the EU, very, very different set of rules on data protection. And also, when you look at passengers having, from an immigration standpoint, passengers having to move from, let's say, the EU, or you're pushing passengers from the EU to the US, very, very different approach to these things. And there's a dedicated team that looked after this, and we had someone in my organization at the time who was dedicated to working with these groups to make sure that we were always briefed on what was required.
Peter, do you have any experience working with sort of regulators over in Australia and other parts of the world which Qantas serviced? Has that also been your experience?
Yeah, I think we've all had some sort of level of experience. I think we did rely, that's one of the advantages we had using Amadeus, and then Global Reach was a heavy reliance. But I think what Amadeus did do well was recognize what they could control globally versus what we needed to control locally, and being able to separate those two, because there were certain things in certain regions that you just can't adapt to a central system across 130 airlines across the world to meet all of those needs. So being able to find that line, I think, was really important for both of our organisations, so we understood where to play.
Right. So let's come to maybe a little bit of soul searching, I suppose. Where do we think opportunities to improve might lie? And Katrina, I'll come to you first with that question. I mean, you mentioned service improvement programs and so on. So let's jump on that. Where do you see the maximum? I mean, historically, where has the maximum number of opportunities to improve been, and then perhaps has the pandemic changed that?
I think from my experience, when I did start at Qantas, it was all new to me. I didn't know the aviation industry at all. And it took me probably a good 2 years to, I feel, really get it. And my ITIL Masters helped me do that, because I had to speak to everybody from the organisation, from pilots to chefs to IT people. I think where the opportunity lays, and I do see it, I think IT has made a big change in the last few years, is to become more towards a business and encourage IT people to sit more with the business rather than separate, work more closely with the suppliers and have a true partnership. Because, again, speaking from experience, Amadeus has a wealth of amazing people, amazing systems. And what I was going to say too, actually, is data. And to use data. I don't think we use data as much as we could have. So an example is, as Pete said, we were good at when someone falls off the cliff. We're really great at getting it all better. But Amadeus, for example, had data that was on trending. So we could have used that data more effectively to say, if there's a dip in trends, well, there's something wrong at the airport. And we didn't actually really do that. So that's where I think the change should come, is business working more, IT working more with business, and using data more effectively.
So if I understand correctly, we're talking more about predictive analytics than retrospective analytics.
Yeah, and what I found really interesting actually was, even though a potential event or incident may not be because of Amadeus systems, the volumes would drop, so that would allow Qantas to be more proactive and preventative. Yeah.
Okay. Do you see I mean, obviously, most of us have a common experience in that we've experienced air travel rather than sort of, had a peek behind the curtain, as it were, about who's pulling all the levers and dials. Do you think there are opportunities to improve the customer's experience, or is that sort of more on the airport's onus as opposed to maybe on the airline side of things?
But I think actually it comes back to service level agreements, working with suppliers to create service level agreements that are customer orientated and employees, not just employees as well. So some of the SLAs we started to introduce was the service provider would recommend, based on their data, better ways for fuel efficiency, for example. So it's not just about IT metrics. What's another one that ways to optimize crew?
I mean, we come across this a lot in some other industries. This effect of watermelon SLAs, green on the outside but red on the inside. Is that also something that you see, Chris and Peter? Is that also something that you've seen at your time working in the aviation sector? And I know Katrina's been talking a lot about introducing SLAs that drive different behaviors, and that's absolutely right. But do you see that sort of the flip side, that sometimes it drives unintended behaviors?
You want to go, Chris, or?
I'll let you go first, Pete.
Good question, actually.
It is a good question. So the watermelon effect, I think that came down to generally measuring the wrong thing, because you're just measuring by the pure availability and uptime of a server. But in delivering a service or an outcome to a customer, there's many pieces in that chain to make it work. And so one piece of the chain falling down might be enough to break it. And one supplier may not own that piece of the chain, but having everybody in the chain realize that there's a customer at the end and they're the most important was always going to be the bigger challenge, because everyone's making sure they were protecting that patch a little bit. I think as we've gotten better and we've got better handle around the data, I think, one of the things we've seen is sort of more agile ways of working and squad-based tribes or teams, or whichever word you want to use for it. By having those blended teams sitting together, you're giving the advantage of technology in the business truly understanding each other, which was always the end game. And so those people understand the impact at that given point in time. So my sense is, but what we've got to do is we've got to have enough trust with suppliers. I think this is where Chris and I there'll be some agreement, but Chris is, the Amadeus organization always wanted to get close to the customer, but and I think Katrina touched on, or after you asked about, who owns it? Is it the airport that's creating the experience? Is the airline creating the experience? Or is it Amadeus? Or is it all of us creating the experience? And we're all vying for that component. But the experience of individuals and flight will change for sure. And you can see what's happened in the pandemic. You look back sort of 10 years ago in Australia and sort of domestic check-in and the arrival of kiosks. Now kiosk will be a thing of the future and not too distant, because everything will be off your device. You will do everything off the airport, other than when you arrive at the airport and drop your bag, and it'll go through a security scanner and it will arrive at a destination. So the experience will evolve, and we will have to continue to find new ways to support that experience. But I think to do that, we're going to have to create new partnerships with our partners and suppliers and allow them to get closer and understand that, because that's the best way for them to service it and not keep them at arm's length.
So this actually gives rise to two follow-on questions, and I'll come to Chris with the first. Do you see service integration and management, or the need for that sort of dedicated governance layer or governance organization, pulling all these multiple providers together to be able to deliver a singular experience to the customer? Is that something that you see a lot across multiple regions or multiple companies, or is it still very much the sort of fragmented supply chain management construct at the moment?
My view, it's still very much fragmented, and I think it's only going to become more complex. There will only be more and more partners being included, and I think there's a huge opportunity now to really have that topic of who owns the traveler back on the table and to start looking at new KPIs, new operational level of agreements, which must include airports, ground handling agents, etc., in order to really drive the experience that airlines and travelers do expect to have. But today it's not there. And I think, and I go back to this point, I think the airline business division would be the best area to drive this discussion. Because that's where most of the investments are coming from, and the direction of digitalization is coming from the business, and then the IT portion of it has to underpin what the business has defined as the vision and strategy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Katrina, do you also see sort of more and more investments into sort of service integration and governance? Or would you agree with Chris there that it is still highly fragmented and there's an urgent need for some attention in that space?
Totally agree, Chris. I believe it's fragmented. Having said that, at Qantas, we set up a very robust SIAM capability. I think that worked very, very well, to be honest. But I've obviously worked with other organisations since, and I do believe it is fragmented. I think too, back to SLAs, back to money, root of all evil, what drives behaviour, unfortunately. And I think that we need that maturity and trust in service providers. And it goes back, a little bit actually to the watermelon reporting, and this is a true story. Many years ago at Qantas, the bag tags were printing the incorrect destination, but there was no breach of service levels. And so, because the system was available and the response time was okay, so and then when the service provider produced the monthly report, it was green, and that is an example of, it was more than just one service provider that the break in the chain, as Pete said. And how do you get all your service providers together in a room and understand their contribution to the end outcome? Printing a correct boarding pass.
I mean, I had an interesting conversation. I think we were recording a podcast talking about, value stream mapping and how value stream mapping can help break down silos. But we were talking about if value stream mapping can help break down silos across suppliers as well. And, we were talking about the difference between scope of influence and scope of control, that a lot of times when you're working with suppliers, all you have is scope of influence because you can sort of invoke, contractual clauses, or you can just simply choose to move to a different supplier at the end of the term of that contract, etc. But that's very much stick approach rather than the carrot approach. So it's interesting to see how whether some of these newer ways of working are. I think a lot of these newer ways of working, cultural elements, etc., are definitely manifesting at the sort of operational level, at the coalface. But whether they're sort of translating through the levels or layers of the organization, I think is yet to be seen. But I did mention that there were two topics that came to mind during the last question. We just touched on one of them, which was service integration and management. The second one, just to riff on what you've been saying about SLAs, Katrina, is XLAs. And do you see? I mean, I'll be absolutely honest. To my mind, nobody's adequately explained the difference between an XLA and an SLA to me, or shown me a concrete example of an XLA. I could be wrong. I'm only one person. I'm sure they exist somewhere, in a mythical land far, far away. But do you think that, with the focus coming more and more on that customer's experience, at the airport, or the freight customer's experience, etc., do you feel like XLAs are possibly a way to drive some of the behavioral change that we've all been wishing for on this panel?
100%, yes. But actually, if I may ask, someone's obviously giving you an example. What's an example that someone's given you about XLA and you didn't find?
I mean, I can't think of any concrete example of an XLA, but every time they've described an XLA to me, it's been more about taking the existing SLA structure and substituting a customer experience metric for some other type of metric. Yeah. That's the only difference I've seen. So again, with my issue with SLAs is a lot of times there is no escape clause built into SLAs. They start to drive the wrong behavior because the measure becomes the target rather than an indicator of performance. And so that's why I question whether XLAs have matured, the concept of an XLA has matured enough that it's going to make a difference. But again, I could be completely wrong. And that's why I thought I'd ask the panel here whether you've seen XLA start to sort of creep into your organizations and your ways of thinking and talking about the work that you've been doing.
Can I just add a different?
Yeah.
So I think the interesting one might be to consider whether we put, can you turn the SLAs around to being how do you incentivize people for actually preventing problems in the first place? So what happens if you've got a base performance level and then you're actually incentivizing people for actually coming in early and actually showing you how to prevent or stop incidents from occurring? But whether you want to call it an experience SLA, we still need, and I still believe ultimately, is that outside of the systems, there's people involved, and those people we need to communicate to and have a common understanding about their part in the puzzle. And that can only be done by bringing everyone together and removing the boundary of the organizations and recognizing the impact we're actually having. But, I'd like to see the conversation, which is the conversation we were starting to have earlier, which is, how many incidents am I preventing from occurring rather than the ones I've had to recover? So how do I start using data in a much more intuitive way that's out there and start to go, actually, because a number of times I sat in major incidents, someone goes, oh, I could have told you that was going to happen. Well, that doesn't help me now. All right, I wanted to know a week out that server is likely to fail for these particular reasons or whatever it happens to be, but they're the examples. And I think that if we can turn that conversation around, then I think we can start to change the game.
I must apologize to our audience because we did get a question in asking what an XLA is. So an XLA is an experience level agreement, which derived from SLA, obviously, that acronym, but rather than measuring a quality of service, you're measuring an experience. And I suppose that is also my other big issue with the concept of an XLA, because as human beings, our experiences are built on a multitude of smaller experiences, and a lot of that can be measured and a lot of it cannot be measured, and trying to force a measurement onto something that's so complex, so subjective, so emotive, for me feels wrong. But again, I'm happy to be proven wrong on this. We did have another question coming in, and this is probably where we'll switch to the Q&A side. And we have a question coming in from Alex, which I think we did touch upon at the beginning of the call, Chris, which was, the airline industry or the aviation industry is one of the ones that's been most affected by COVID. And how do you see ITSM helping? Well, the question is about airlines, but maybe we can broaden that. How do you see ITSM helping the sector in general in staying alive, not just through the continued pandemic now, but of course, I think Peter mentioned there might be another pandemic just around the corner. There might be some other sort of crisis just around the corner. And how do you see ITSM helping prepare the industry for to weather these waves?
I think I mentioned before, it's complex today. And I think the way ITSM can help the entire sector is for the different groups. And let's take the airline, because if we add the travel agencies, we add hospitality, we add everyone else, it becomes even much larger to address. But I think already, if there could be someone, and I'm going to put the ownership on the airline here, the airline to take the lead and really drive the discussion around, the different type of incidents that can occur, what's best, what are the operational level of agreements across the entire chain. This would help the industry. And the second thing would be that I would say push as much capability to the airline frontline staff as possible. These two things. But I think the first thing is to fix the fragmented support process. This is the biggest thing today that needs to be tackled.
Okay.
I can give you one example. We started
Sure.
to, when I was with Amadeus, we started to do this with Katrina and with Pete. Going as far as to put, Amadeus personnel up front to better understand how the systems that have been implemented are being used. And it was really an eye-opener for all of us. And I think this needs to be done to really, really address the fragmented support approach right now. This is the first step, and it's a big one.
Thank you for that. We have another question that's coming from Omar, and I think, Peter, if you don't mind, I'll throw this question to you. I'll read the question verbatim and then maybe see how we can answer that. The question itself is, how mature was the IT change management process at Qantas? And I think there's lots and lots and lots of elements to it, because there's one aspect which is how mature was the change management or change enablement, as we call it in ITIL 4, around the technology aspects. But then what about at the service layer? How did change enablement or change management play out at the service layer? So I think there's two aspects to that question, but feel free to answer either or both.
So I think towards the, over time, go back many years, before we went through a fairly significant, what I would call service management transformation initiative, which was a complete change in the way we thought about service management, certainly within the airline space. Was it mature? It was working, but I think the challenge is we weren't necessarily asking the right questions all the time. And so what we started to see towards the end, I think, is a lot more of the questions being around having a much deeper understanding of the impact across the board. So if we were going to change a server down in the data center room or somewhere out in the cloud area or whatever it was, did we really understand what that was connected to and the impact that was going to have? And did we understand and I think the real shift that was occurring as in the later phases of it was the business prepared, and do they truly have a BCP plan in place should we actually have an event where we couldn't recover? And
sorry, BTP standing for?
Business continuity plan.
Oh, BCP, sorry.
Yeah. So I think, that was the shift that we were really seeing, is because there were some incidents that could go on for many hours, but the reliance on technology now was so heavy. And if you can't move to a DR environment because of the complexities of that, then you need to have a solid BCP plan that would really support it. So I would say we had a very mature process, within the airline space, but there was always room to continue to evolve that as we understood certainly the last airline it was 100 years old, and the complexity of that shouldn't be underestimated,
Sure.
But
so
a low-cost airline was the opposite of that. So.
I'll ask a follow-up, which is that, a lot of organizations are sort of delegating a lot of the responsibility around change management to decide whether a change can go through, etc. A lot of that delegation is happening more and more towards operational staff, frontline staff, as it were, so that agile teams with CI/CD pipelines, etc., can working on highly available, elastic cloud, etc., etc. A lot of that change authority has been delegated downwards. I completely understand the risk management aspect to change, but that you were just describing. Does a business understand the risk of the change and so on? Do you feel like in the airline industry, it's still very much that sort of centralized change management construct that we used to have in years past? Or do you think the airline industry is also starting to move towards delegation of change authority to create more resilience, perhaps, or greater agility and flexibility?
Yeah, well, I think it's somewhat dependent on the airline, but we were certainly running almost both models. So our cloud-based environment almost had 100% success rate, because you could design and build for that change, and be able to deploy in that. So we had a model which was basically, we would delegate freedom into those teams, but we would monitor and track it. And if you were having an impact, then we would remove your ability to be able to make those changes. So it was we go for trust, certainly in the cloud-based space, but if you started to misuse that, then we had the ability to almost revoke that ability for you to be able to make those changes with that level of freedom until you demonstrated the maturity of being able to do it and using, and I think that's the beauty of the cloud-based environment. Use the advantage of that environment to protect the airline and continue to generate those experiences. But we're still, at the back heart of it, we were still an airline with a whole lot of mainframes, and so you still need to run fairly traditional change management practices for those components as well. And the reality is, your cloud environment's fantastic, but if it can't connect to the data source, we're still in trouble.
Fair enough. We're almost out of time, but I have one last question that I'd like to ask. This is my question. This is not from the audience, so audience, please do bear with me. What's the deal with air ticket pricing? I mean, honestly, what IT systems and data is making the decisions that I buy a ticket for £500 when the person sitting next to me on the same plane paid half that price?
What's the deal with
that?
That's another webinar, actually.
Yeah, it's called inventory management.
Yeah, inventory management designed to attract the best out of the customer at the right time. Well, it's the most disposable asset. Once the asset's in the air, there's nothing we can do about it. So you've got to optimizing that seat price, and I think that's what airlines and a lot of, and certainly I know Amadeus were very hot to trot in this space, which was how to use data to maximum effect to benefit the customer. So, and you can see it today, you can watch fares and flights, and link those things in. So the ability to take that data and be able to use it for the wisdom to try to entice that customer to purchase that ticket at that time for a particular price. The real smarts that are being involved in that space. But there's more to come in that space, I have no doubt.
Fair enough. We do have a few more questions coming in, but I think we're almost out of time. So what we might do is solicit some answers in written form and publish maybe a blog post answering some of the remaining questions. So to the audience, you can keep an eye out on the axelos.com website, and we'll link to it on various social media channels when we get around to publishing that blog post. But there are some interesting remaining questions that I wish we had the time to answer, but Harry's telling me that we only have a couple of minutes left. So in those couple of minutes, and you can hear the church bells ringing in the back there. Sorry about that. So it just leaves me with an opportunity to thank our wonderful panel for joining us today. It's pretty late in the evening, I think, in Australia. So Peter and Katrina, thank you very much for making the time out of your evenings to join us today. And Chris, it's only the start of the day, so I'm sure you have more important things that emails that have been flowing in since this conversation started. So again, thank you for making the time to join us today. Just a quick round of social media plugs. Where can people find you? Katrina, what's the best place to get hold of you to discuss anything that may have come up in the chat today?
Thank you, Akshay, and thank you for the opportunity. LinkedIn profile, Katrina McDermott's probably the easiest. Yeah.
Excellent. And Peter, same question.
Yeah, LinkedIn profile, Peter McDonald. So you'll be able to find me there. It's nice and easy. So.
Excellent. And Chris, last but not least.
Thank you for having me. I would say LinkedIn profile as well, Chris Dolphin.
Excellent. And to the audience, if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask the panel as part of that blog post, for example, please do send an email in at ask@axelos.com. And until our next panel discussion or the next chance we have to interact, please stay safe, wear a mask, and wash your hands.
Thank you.